All right, great. So we have about 45 minutes. So we do have a lot to cover. What I'd like to do is, judging by the crowd, we'll touch the business side of things. We'll look at the solution from an architecture side, and we'll also look at it from a techie side, just to cover all bases to make sure that everyone is covered. All right, so here's the agenda for the next 45 minutes. We're going to walk through the challenge. So what is the problem? Just break it down a little bit. Then we're going to look at the solution. And actually, we'll run through a demo. So we'll actually demo it, and we'll try to demo it fairly quickly. And then we're going to walk through how we were able to rapidly develop this on top of the platform. So if you remember what Newton was saying, Paul was saying, you can make Alfresco do what you want. And that's one of the most beautiful things about it. And not only that, it's very flexible, very open, you know, as they chime that point. And we'll take a look at how, using the Alfresco tools, we can quickly build a solution based on Alfresco. And again, that was an important point that those guys chimed in on, is solution, 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 just hammering that point. And then we can open up for discussions. But if you guys want to stop me in between for something critical, feel free to do so as well. All right? All right, so let's go ahead and just jump into the challenge. All right, and so the purpose of today, so we're going to look at FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. So basically what that is government agencies are required, particularly the executive branch, where if a citizen, or anyone for that matter, it doesn't actually have to be a citizen, wants information, some public information about some particular agency, that agency is required to give that information back to the end user. And there's some stuff that happens in between. Sometimes they have to pay, sometimes they don't. You know, sometimes they won't relinquish the information because it's PII, things of that nature. But it varies. And what we want to look at, and the challenge is that governments have tons and tons and tons of information. I mean, right now, if you look at my prop here, they have boxes of information. And let me give you some stats of how much. So typically, Joe, the average federal employee, prints about 34 pages per day. And so there are about 2.5 million federal employees. And if you look at that, it's about 90 million pages per day. I mean, that's a lot of paper, right? And then from a drawer standpoint, so a typical drawer, 4-drawer cabinet, holds about 10 to 12,000 documents. So and it takes up about 9 square feet. So if you sort of do the math, a little fuzzy math, it's not exact, but that's approximately 9,000 cabinets per day. The equivalent is 3 floors, so 3 hotel floors per day. If you were to put cabinets just here, it's about 20,000 or so square feet per floor. And the other part of the challenge is that citizens want access to this information. So since this law passed, they want to get access to the information, but the problem is it's not very easy to get access because most of that access, or the information still lives on paper. But in order to give it to that citizen, they have to do lots of different things. And what's happening to the agencies, since all of these FOIA requests are coming in, they're getting backed up. And it's just so they can't do their day job, they have to handle FOIA requests all the time. So much so they have to set up new departments for FOIA, and that's increasing our costs in terms of tax dollars, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that the government isn't willing, but it's just that the process is truly, truly expensive, right? If you look at the full life cycle, you have to go from scanning all this paper, capturing that information, storing it, securing it, being able to search for it, retrieve it, annotate it, redact it, analyze, print, report, archive, dispose, and finally expose it. Sometimes you expose it to your website, which we will see. Sometimes you actually need to email it, et cetera. But how do you do that securely? And how do you remove the social security numbers, if there are any in there, with the act of redacting before sending it out to that end user? And that's the full process. And we'll look at how Alfresco, from a solution standpoint, in addition to some other open source tools, helps to solve this entire life cycle problem. All right, so let's take a look at the solution. So at the very beginning, so the first part of the solution, and as a matter of fact, I'll begin to pass out some stuff, some paper. There you go. And this is important just to have you guys follow along. Thanks, Senpai. So the first part of the solution is FESoft. So FESoft is an open source solution, and they're actually represented here. And they handle the capture, the scanning and the capture side of, remember that full life cycle? That's what they handle. And they're very good at doing that. They're open source. They have a very flexible architecture. Their pricing is phenomenal. It's about like 80% less than other proprietary solutions. It's web-based, which is not a thing that you see often, right? So what that means is I can bring my scanner here, and I can, instead of having a centralized scanner in some back room, I can actually have the scanner at my desk and still work with the system, which is awesome. The next part of the solution is Drupal. So Drupal, again, is an open source solution. And typically what we'll see here is how Drupal is a front-end, web-based, almost like a website kind of, not almost, but is a website, driving application. Okay, and some details about that. And of course, Alfresco. So Alfresco remains that platform that sits underneath all of this that makes it all work. And I won't talk about Alfresco now since you guys are at an Alfresco conference, so you know much about it. And Deja is very important. Deja is represented here as well. They're the ones that handle the annotations and redaction. So let's say you scan a piece of a document, but then that document has some PII on it. You need to redact that document before giving it out to the public. All right. And it's embedded within Share, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Again, Alfresco can integrate with your CRMs, ERPs. David has done a lot of that good work with Salesforce. You can just secure data access, cloud infrastructure, very flexible. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the demo, just for the sake of time. I know that there's a lot to cover, but I wanted to at least set this business context because I found that even as a techie person, even if I were to go to a techie presentation, if we jump right into the tech side, we somehow, although I can follow like the pieces, but you miss a lot, right? And so for me, technology itself, if it doesn't have a business context, I mean, it's pointless anyways, right? I mean, technology is meant to solve business problems. And so I want to make sure that we at least describe what the business challenge is, and then from there, put the demo, put the tech side in context in relation to the business challenge. All right, so at this time, we're going to jump right into the demo. All right, so in order to take one of these. So as part of this demo, we're going to use this document to follow along, okay? And I'll walk you through the use case of what we're about to see. So first, we'll look at this top portion. So what's happening is the government scanned a lot of these documents via FESoft, right? And so now they have it digitized. That information is then pushed over to Alfresco. All right, so now, Alfresco has it, is aware of it, has secured it, added the old ACLs on it, permissioning, etc. So what's going to happen is Joe, who's a citizen, he says, hey, I just heard about this FOIA thing, and one of my neighbors, Joe lives on like 200 Sutter Street, and one of his neighbors who lives at 100 Sutter Street, the house is vacant, it's just being vandalized, the grass is overgrown, it's looking pretty bad. So Joe wants to know, hey, are there any kind of liens, or just, can you give me more information about this property? Because it's a nuisance, I want it fixed. So he's going to submit a FOIA request requesting information about this 100 Sutter Street. All right, so that's the premise of this demo. And then from there, Frank, who works for the government, he's an analyst, he's going to receive that request. And how he does that, he gets an email. So the moment that Joe submits the FOIA request, Joe gets an email, Frank gets an email letting him know that, hey, someone just submitted a FOIA request that you should check it out. Frank will then do some research. He'll do Google-like searching using Alfresco's Lucene and Solar engines, and he'll retrieve those documents, redact those documents, collaborate, etc. And I'm going to skip this next part, but then from here you'll see how Frank, using a simple drag and drop method, can request approval. So before he can send it over to Joe, his business says he has to get approval. So we'll see via simple drag and drop that Frank just drags a folder over and he requests approval. At that point, Sally, who's the chief FOIA officer, she gets an email letting her know, hey, you need to approve this. She'll approve it, and then it'll get pushed out to the website. All right, so just looking at it from an architecture standpoint, we're going to go from here all the way to here. So we'll go from where we capture the information, it gets stored in Alfresco, right? Frank is going to work with Alfresco to find the information, redact it, and then we'll finally push it out to the website, and we'll also push it out to the mobile device. All right? And then from a techie standpoint, we'll look at how we were able to build this solution very rapidly, all right, using the Alfresco platform. All right, so let's get cranking. So the very first step in this solution is, remember, so Joe navigates to the website, which is built on Drupal, and he sees different things, services, resources, etc. And there's this really important thing called the e-reading room. This is a FOIA sort of concept. Notice here, it's empty, and we're going to come back to this, okay? So just remember, this part here, it's not empty, but this section here is somewhat empty. All right, so Joe says, hey, I want to submit a FOIA request. So he clicks on Submit FOIA Request, and he puts his name. That's my phone number there. Okay. All right, so here, so he's provided information about he's given it a title, description, etc. So this is within Drupal. So he'll go ahead and just submit his FOIA request. And several things will happen at this point. Once it's submitted, he'll get a FOIA request confirmation. So he'll get a FOIA request confirmation. And in addition, we'll receive some emails. So remember, Joe's going to receive an email, and Frank the analyst will also receive an email. Okay, it just came in. All right, so it basically tells Joe, hey, Joe, thank you for submitting your FOIA request. Here's your ID. We've received it. Thank you. All right, we'll get back to you soon. And then Frank, who's the analyst, received an email as well. It says, hey, a new citizen or citizen just submitted a FOIA request. Here's the link to access it. At which point, Joe he could be on the road. He'll take his iPad. He can start doing the research there. So I'm logging in as Frank. I'm already logged in here for the sake of speed. But here you'll notice that the metadata has been added. So you remember, so this is like eForms. So you went from a website, a public-facing website, using a form, and that got created in Alfresco with Alfresco metadata. All right, so you'll notice the name, the title, description, citizen's name, email, etc. All right, so Frank now, he's going to start doing his research. He can just do Google-like searching here to search for 100 Sutter Street. Okay, so he sees that there's some documents here. What I'm going to do is just navigate to the site. And have all of you seen Share before? Okay, great. So we're not going to spend any time talking about Share from this perspective. All right, so Frank comes here. He knows where the documents live. It's in the housing folder. All right, so he's now looking for lien information about 100 Sutter Street. He sees that there's a lien folder. He sees the Sutter Street. What we'll do is we're going to make a copy here to the request folder. Okay, so in addition, he's going to provide the deed information over for Joe. All right, and lastly, he's going to provide some reviews. So typically what they do at this place is they have like a review panel. Okay. Bingo. So at this point, Frank just did all of his research. He compiled the documents that he wants to send over to Joe. He's going to send over a deed of trust, the lien notice, and also the review document. Okay, so at this time, He can collaborate with other people on it. He can redact it using Deja right from here, annotate it, etc. But what we'll do, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step where Frank is going to request approval. All right, we're going to do so via simple drag and drop. And I'll show you how all of this is working from a backend standpoint once we're done. All right, and so how we were able to rapidly develop this using the Alfresco platform. So I'm going to take this request folder. I'm going to simply drag it over to this pending approvals folder. And using Alfresco rules, Alfresco workflow, you'll see a lot of cool things happen under the covers. All right? So at this time, Sally, who's the FOIA officer, she gets an email letting her know that, hey, she has to approve this before Joe can get it. Okay? Everybody following me so far? Wonderful. All right, so here it is. So the email just came in. So it says that, hey, Frank the analyst is requesting your approval. Click on this link, etc. So that way you can see this stuff. I'm going into a different browser because I'm already logged in as Sally here, just to expedite things. All right, so notice I'm logged in as Sally the manager. All right, so there are 3 different documents here. And what Sally can do is simply approve the FOIA request. So let's say that she says, hey, this document looks good, but this one doesn't. So she can approve some and reject others. But let's approve them. All right, and the last thing she wants to do is approve the entire request. And once we do this, a lot will happen. Okay? So you'll notice that it's been moved. And this is using Alfresco rules, which we'll see shortly here, how all of this happened in the background. But the key thing at this point is the document was now pushed from Alfresco to Drupal using CMS views. All right? So as soon as Sally says, yes, I approve this, now it's available to Joe on the website using CMS, if you look at this printed document, using CMS to push it out. So you're pushing selective documents outwards, right? Because you may have sensitive information here, but we only want to push only the ones that we want, which is okay. So now let's go back and take a look at the All right, so remember when I said about this e-reading room to come back, that we would come back here and that it was empty? Notice now using the CMS views, and again, this is using all open source technology, so this isn't, we aren't paying additional licenses, so if your site, and you technically don't even need Drupal, so if you already have an existing site, you can actually plug in this sort of method, right, using CMS and push this into your own site and work fairly seamlessly. So you'll notice the different documents here. And I'll download this to my desktop. All right, so once it's done, it'll open. And notice this time around, the document that Joe gets is the redacted version and not the original version that we scanned in. All right, and so this is very critical because from a just compliance standpoint, from all of that, you really can't give public information or private information out to the public. And that's really, if you look at it from an end-to-end, so this is what Powell and Newton were talking about from a solution standpoint, right? Because if you look at Alfresco, it's a platform that sits very low, whose hands can go many different places and who can do many different things. And the beauty of this is, the power of Alfresco is that it can solve so many different problems. And that's part of the issue with the messaging, them trying to figure out what's the right messaging for the platform. But overall, it's a rock solid, awesome platform. And if you look, we're able to solve this sort of FOIA problem fairly quickly. Okay? So let's actually go through at this time and look at it more so from a techie perspective. So we spent the time, if we go back to PowerPoint and look at where we are, right, so we spent the time just looking at the overall business challenge. So what is the problem, or what is the challenge? And then we looked at a solution, so we broke it down to the open source components. You have FESOF, who then its job is to take documents, all those file cabinets worth of documents, scan them in, push them over to Alfresco using CMIS. Okay? Now, once Alfresco has it, the business users can come in, log in, use the Deja viewer to redact those documents, collaborate against those documents, secure those documents, route, use business processes via workflow, and route those documents appropriately via and get the right approvals. And then from there, push it out to your public-facing website, or push it out to email, or push it out to a mobile tablet. Okay, so that's what we looked at that, we demoed that, and now let's look at it from a techie standpoint, see what happened underneath the covers. All right, so here there are a few things we'll want to describe. So this whole notion of sort of rapid development, there'll be there are different approaches that you can take, where if you want to harden the application, you'll have to take a more robust approach. But for the most part, Alfresco lends itself to very rapid development. In fact, I know at the FDA, and Art here, we're doing some work for him, we're able to develop a fairly complex solution where we're managing a lot of funky stuff. I won't talk about it now, but I mean, it's pretty complicated stuff. We're able to do that very quickly, and Art could attest to that. I mean, it was just almost like 2 months where we were able to build a super complex solution. But the reason we were able to do it is because we have a rock-solid platform through which, or that we can make those changes and build it. So what we want to look at from a techie standpoint, we'll look at Drupal Forms. We'll then look at Alfresco web scripts. We'll look at Alfresco content models, email templates, scripting rules, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the components that went into building this solution. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is the Drupal Forms. So here, we're just creating a simple Drupal page. And this could be on any website. Hey, man. On any website at all, where even if it's not Drupal, if you have your existing website, it's simply creating a form. But the submit button, where you point that submit, will be to an Alfresco web script. Right? So Alfresco will then handle that form payload, right, and do what you want it to do with it, the different business logic that you're looking for. Right? So that's the first step. The next step is where you want to create a content model. So what a content model does, it says, Alfresco, I have a lot of information, but Alfresco doesn't know how to store it. Right? You have to sort of tell it, how do you want to store that information? This content model allows you, or tells Alfresco exactly how you want to store that information. So if you have an invoice, you then create a content model for that invoice that says, hey, Alfresco, I'm about to send you some invoices. This is what I want to know about these invoices, like name, company, etc. So we had to create a content model for FOIA requests. And here, we created this content model within the repository. This isn't necessarily best practice. For the sake of rapid development, though, and for the sake of like demoing this and showing this, you can see how this is fairly easy. But what you would typically do is remove this from here, put it in an AMP file. You create like a Maven project or something like that, and inject it via Spring and tie it all in. But here we can quickly take a look at that model. Right? And so really what you're doing is just defining or telling Alfresco how do you want it to store that data. Okay. The next thing in the equation are email templates. So as you can tell, so far, we're sort of writing all of this. Yes, there's a little bit of code, but so far we're able to build this usually almost exclusively from this user interface. Right? Which is amazing to build such a complex solution, right, rapidly, fairly easily. So here we created several email templates. So the approved email template, the received, the manager approval, submitted, etc. And these are free market templates. So you will need to know a little bit of code, but for the most part, what I'm trying to highlight here is the flexibility of the solution and its ability and your ability to create things rather quickly. All right, so this is basically some HTML, and this represents the emails that we received. Okay, the next item on the list is scripting. So Alfresco has a very powerful scripting API where we can create and do really cool things using just JavaScript. And we tap into the Alfresco API underneath using this sort of well-known language called JavaScript. And here, it's a very simple function, and all we're doing is sending an email. So we're using this, this Alfresco's Actions API to send an email, and we just send some properties, some details, who the email is from, the template to use, and that's it. All right. Okay. And then the next item on the list is this notion of rules. Is everybody familiar with rules, by the way? Alfresco rules? Okay, great. So overall, it's a very powerful thing. I mean, sometimes I see it's somewhat underutilized, but it's a very, very powerful notion. So we're able to route all of this sort of funky stuff. If you notice, when you drag and drop, this thing happened, that triggered, all that happened really via rules. Okay? If we go here on Manage Rules, so what we're saying is items that are created or into this folder that have the aspect FOIA request, and Newton mentioned this notion of aspect earlier, property groups, I think we're calling it officially now, or unofficially. But again, that goes back to our content model. It's just how you define your content. You're telling Alfresco how do you want to store it, and we use a property group or whatever, an aspect. So if it has this property group, then do this. And the action we're doing here is performing we're adding a simple workflow to that document. All right? So far, as you see here, I mean, we're able to build this almost exclusively from the user interface, right? Which is very, very powerful. Like a powerful concept indeed. All right? And the next thing for me we're going to look at is this notion of a CMS API. So Drupal has a CMS module that allows Drupal to connect or talk to other CMS compliant repositories. All right, so we use this module and also the CMS Views module, which the CMS Views sits on top of the CMS API, CMS module, and what it does, it just exposes and shows the documents, just like we did when you saw on the Drupal site. You saw those 3 documents with the icon and the text. All right, so we use these 2 modules in order to make that happen. All right, and some details about the CMS Views. Really, what you're doing is pointing it to a destination. So we created a FOIA site, document library, e-reading room, and any file in here, it'll show. It'll display on the website. All right, so far, as you can see, almost all of this you could actually do this from a user interface standpoint. We typically don't, simply because and the reason for it's not portable. So if we were to do this in our dev environment, you couldn't easily migrate this to test or to pre-prod, right? Or to prod. So what you do, the recommendation is, instead of doing it this way, you typically put these files. All right, let me switch over. Let me see if this is correct. So typically, you'd want to sort of create your own sort of module structure. And here you'll have, you see, these are Spring files where you can then inject the models. Right? So as opposed to uploading it directly to the repository, you instead are able to pull it from here. So on load time, you can inject that FOIA model. And this is pretty critical because then I can take that AMP file, which is basically wrapping up all of that code that we saw using the user interface, and I can go from one environment to another. I can move from my local development to my continuous integration environment. Once it's ready there, move it to test, ready there, pre-prod, and eventually prod. right, so look at this, minimize this here. So in terms of time as well, and this is really what I wanted to show. If you look at from a techie standpoint, and now we can open up for some discussions. And but just to recap, so what we showed, if you look at the, let's go back and launch this. We looked at what the business problem is, right? So we look at FOIA. FOIA as a whole is just having, or the government being required to be more transparent, right? Which is awesome, because we're spending all this money. I mean, in working for the government, I firsthand see how much money they waste. Like, believe me, and Art will attest. I mean, a lot is wasted. And so forcing them to be more transparent, I think, is helpful, because at least we'll be able to say, hey, how did you spend our money last year? And you can make that FOIA request, by the way, which is awesome to know, at which point at least you can hold our politicians accountable. All right, so we look at that overall as a challenge, and although that the government is willing to do it, the process itself is fairly expensive, extensive, and it's somewhat hard because it requires so many different steps, so many different technologies, and they end up launching new departments to sort of handle all of these requests. And we looked at the solution, we demoed the solution, and we looked at how, from a techie standpoint, we were able to rapidly develop this thing. And then we looked at some best practices on how to harden and deploy it across multiple environments. So at this time, I mean, that's really it. We can open up for some discussion, some questions. And yeah, I tried to cover a lot in a short period of time, but hopefully you guys got some stuff out of it. Judging by your faces, it's kind of hard to tell, but everyone's just like, So I don't know if I'm boring you guys to death, but oh, the twosies. It's the case of the twosies, yeah. But any questions overall? Yeah, go ahead, Art.
At the beginning of the process, you copied the files from one folder to another.
Yep.
It kind of rubbed me wrong that you had to do that.
Okay.
So why did you have to copy the files, physically copy them and move them from one file folder to another?
Beautiful. So what we can do instead, and this is one of the benefits of Alfresco. So as opposed to copying, as Art says here, so let's go back to the lean, to the 100 Sutter Street lean. Okay? So as opposed to copying, right, which is, for the sake of this demo, is an easy thing to do, right? But for a business, and Art knows his folks won't tolerate 20 steps, right? You don't know how many calls I got from Art. Nope, it's not going to work. Fix it, right? So instead of doing that, what we can do is introduce this notion of an action. Is anyone familiar with action, or just actions in Alfresco? All right, awesome. So as opposed to copying it, because this is very specific to your business, right? So to this solution, it's not something Alfresco can, it's not very generic, so Alfresco just doesn't provide it out of the box. But they do provide a means by which you can customize it and tailor it to suit your needs. And one approach to do that is using this notion of actions, where, notice I created some of these new actions here. So as opposed to just the out of the box, notice there's a create new revision action, right? And there's a queue for distribution, a send to field agents action. And this is all about business processes. So what we can do for you is instead create a new action that says, on these types of documents, do something. So as opposed to copying, you just click on the button and it sends it to your file. And that's a much more clean way and probably a more acceptable way to your business. But I mean, the main point we're trying to highlight, right? Because Alfresco can't be out of the box. It can't solve every problem, and it doesn't try to. But it tries to be a very low platform, and it gives you all, like, a lot of tools to make it easy for us as integrators or just businesses in general to take it and customize it and tailor it to meet your needs. So that's how I would solve that problem, Art. But there are many different approaches. You can take other approaches if you want. Any other questions? And don't be shy, right? I won't bite. Well, and even if I do, it won't be that bad. Just like, just nibble a little bit. All right. Oh, no one's using this solution, so we couldn't give this to someone, right? Because again, it doesn't meet your best practices. You can't go from one environment to another environment easily. And instead of using JavaScript, we'll probably use Java just to harden things a bit, add more unit tests, things of that nature. But for the sake of, really what we're trying to highlight is the ability to, the flexibility of Alfresco as a whole to spin these sort of things up and to solve these problems. But yeah, so no one's using this particular solution. Now, in terms of time, it took a while because what we're trying to do is make sure that this is all set, change the names on the site, sort of customize the demo that way. But overall, you can pull this off in like 3 days or less. If you don't want to customize it too much, it's really not that bad. And if you want to harden it, really have a hardened solution, we can stretch this in about a month and really pull it off. And if you really want to harden it and add a lot more things like reporting and actions addition, maybe 2 months. And that's a beautiful thing in terms of time to market. For a solution that complex, just your total cost of ownership goes down in terms of services cost, the whole nine, because the platform is so robust. Cool beans?
Plus you're controlling the environment versus real life.
Yes, I know that's one of the things that we're working on. I know we've been communicating heavily to Alfresco in terms of, when you deploy this. So it's one thing to deploy this on my local, which this isn't. This is actually in our cloud environment. But it's another thing to deploy it at massive, massive scale. And the issues that we ran into, it's just that Alfresco itself requires so many skill sets. Right? So if you think, oh, I know Java, I know Alfresco. No, right? It's not going to happen. It just, you'll know pieces of it, but it's just so broad. It spans so many different just skill sets that it's a challenge. And then even deploying it with the proper architecture is a challenge in and of itself and requires a different skill set. But overall, it's a great, great product. You guys are here. So I guess you think so too. You paid money here to come here, so hey.
So the redaction that you showed, I assume for demo purposes, is automatically part of your PDF.
Yeah, but what you would do to redact the document, so there's a Deja plugin, and Deja is represented here. They're outside, and instead of this previewer, there's a View 1 preview, the actual Deja previewer. So as opposed to the default share, you'll see the Deja preview, and within here you do your annotations and redactions. So right within share, as opposed to going through some other application.
After it's redacted, it creates a different document that's shared in this scenario.
So there are two ways that you can redact. So there's this notion of an annotation, where what you're doing is sort of overlaying the document, and then there's the actual burning, physical burning, where you can open it with whatever document you want. You can print it. You're not going to be able to look behind the page and, it's still here kind of thing. It's permanently burnt. So those are the two ways of doing it. And it depends. Some people just want to redact it for internal use or just annotate it. And then others, when it's time to give it to someone else, they want to permanently burn it.